Good afternoon, everyone. Very nearly had a technical mishap there. It is. And there's me thinking it would be you, Baz.
And it wasn't me.
10 points. Not sure which watch I was looking at, but it wasn't the right one. Anyway, welcome, folks, to episode 92 of PMI Live. It is 1500-ish in the UK. That means it's time for PMI Live. And this week's episode is a very special one. We've called it An Improver's Journey. And as I'm sure you've gathered by now, the improver is with us, Mr. BB over here. Barry retires from PMI after 14 years in a few weeks' time. And as such, we weren't about to miss the opportunity to get him in the hot seat again for one last time. So there's two main parts to today's session. First of all, I'm going to be chatting to Baz about his career. As many of you will know, it spanned a multitude of sectors and some quite unlikely within there. There is a red thread that Baz will tell us about. And I'm not talking about the top of the papers there. But we'll also focus on some of the engagements that Baz has been involved in before the real body of it, which is Baz sharing his thoughts and reflections. And at this point, if we can't allow him to share his sage words of advice, then when can we? So we're really looking forward to this, Baz. Just a few words before we kick off. Anyone that's joining us on the live streams, it's great to have you with us on YouTube, Facebook, and LinkedIn. If you would like to join us in the live session, it's still available to register. Just go to pmi.co.uk/webinars. And there you will find the registration page and you can come in. Why am I saying that? Because what we want from you guys today is as many questions, as many comments, feedback for Baz. Perhaps you've been on one of his courses over the years and there's something you'd like, and there's something you'd like to say that you dare not say in person. Please do pop it in the chat. We'd love to hear from you. Similarly on the reflections, on a serious note, the reflections as Baz steps through them. I ran through them with him earlier on today in our dry run this morning, and there's some great stuff in there, and we'd really like to hear how that resonates with you. And as I say, it's the last opportunity, so keep him on his toes and make sure he remains in that hot seat for as long as possible. So, Mr. Barry Byrne, tell us. How did you get into this gig?
Well, I just have to say before I even start, two things. One is I see so many lovely names there. It's lovely to see recent and much.
This is very true.
Past people I've worked with and enjoyed working with. So that's one thing. The second thing is I have to admire your bravery, my friend. Asking an Irishman to put 48 years of work into 1 hour. it carries some element of risk.
How did I get into the rehearsal this morning?
Okay, let's move on. So how did I get into this? So my lord, where would we even start? Someone had to do it, I suppose, and that's for sure. I think many of the people I've worked with would recognize that I had a maritime background, and that was probably because all of the work I did was liberally diced with and spread around cliches and proverbs, and often we'd had a maritime basis. So that may well be something that people might remember before. So I actually spent as long at sea as I did with PMI, and sometimes whilst I was at PMI, maybe I might have felt at sea, but that's for another day. That's part of my learning, I suppose. But I was very fortunate actually to spend probably a portion of my career in specifically one location, which was in Oman, and I noticed that the calling note for this talks about being in Oman. And reflecting on this conversation, and of course my experience in my career, Rich, what really strikes me as interesting is that the response I typically got to moving into industry within the UK was how irrelevant being at sea was. And my experience, that 14 years, actually probably didn't count for much when we need you to operate and manage one of our factories here. Now, I always found that then an element of frustrating, because clearly I had a young family and I'm looking for a job, and we all are. And yet these same questions would come across. So what actually makes us have the confidence in you that you can take us where we want to go? And what struck me, and I think I smile about this now, but being at sea is something about knowing where you're going. and why we're going to that location. So that's obviously a good attribute for a business. We knew how to get there, and we had the capabilities to get there. Yeah, so we didn't have to be trained en route. The process of deployment was essentially on the basis that we were always battle ready. And no matter what crises we came upon, we dealt with crises in exactly the same way as we would deal with normal running of the ship. We just saw that as part of this. But I struggled in my early days to make that resonate, and perhaps that was part of me. But someone decided on taking a chance, and that was in the newspaper industry. And you couldn't have gotten much further, Rich, to be perfectly honest. And, there's unashamed name dropping here, but Mr. Maxwell and Mr. Murdoch, of course, were very dominant over the 10 years. So I survived 10 years, so maybe that's part and parcel of that. But there were a few things that struck me, and I mentioned this to you this morning, but I think it's worth mentioning now. Two things that struck me about that, and one of them is, for those who might know Mr. Maxwell, Bob Maxwell, he was a very larger-than-life character. I mean, literally, he was a very big character, but very bullish, and consequently, the culture tended to be bullish. Probably because it's a very reactive, fast-moving product. I don't think there's many more volatile products than newspapers, and that was quite a challenge to get used to today's battles being wiped out because we had a completely new slate the next day. But what struck me about that was, and I think this is, for me, this has been an important point, was this belief that sheer force of character sustains improvement is a complete fallacy.
Yes.
And it's always, I've always been sensitive, Rich, when I've talked to people about processes that depend on an individual, that they're not here, therefore the process stops. And that seems to be, in some cases, an accepted norm. I don't know what your experience is. And I suppose it goes back to the preparedness to accept it's okay for the process to stop because the person isn't there. Or we can only go to this person because they have the Excel spreadsheet. So that's one thing. And of course, Bob Maxwell was a larger-than-life character, and we had significant challenges. And I suppose it's probably fair to talk about briefly what those challenges were. So I had two over the 10 years, I had two things to contend with. One was a business that literally went bankrupt overnight, literally. And this may well be before many of our audience's time. But the company was completely starved of cash, zero cash. And that was overnight. So consequently, when I hear organizations talk about survival, it was probably the ultimate. But I am proud to say that all of those publications still exist, and we didn't miss a beat. And the other end of the continuum, of course, in terms of survival, wasn't necessarily around the business, because I think we're all aware of Sky Corporation and its global presence. So consequently, money was not an issue. But what was an issue was my own personal survival in that organization and how I would fit in that reactive, in the moment firefighting. And firefighting, of course, naturally was endorsed. It was seen to be heroics. And, this concept of heroic seeing us through every day isn't just in the newspaper industry. We talk about, often the work that's done today is done because the heroics of our people. And, it's unfortunate that, senior leaders can tend to overlook that because we don't see that. We don't see the heroics. So that was probably the most profound learning that I had over those 10 years. And I then was really fortunate, and I say that in a nicer sense, because I then moved to Unilever. And I know one or two of our clients here might remember Unilever or still are dealing with Unilever, particularly in the retail sector. And as a supplier to Unilever, they may have a different experience. I appreciate that. I have heard that. Yes. And I'm not talking now the late 90s. And in terms of the inspiration, and I think that's what's important to me. I think it's around the inspiration, the influence, and adaptability. So they're the sort of three words, Rich, that I recognized pretty much from the start of my career all the way through to today: influence, inspiration, and adaptability. And I'm not so bold as to say that influence and inspiration is coming from me, but certainly adaptability would have been one of the hallmarks of my career. And perhaps maybe I might touch on influence and inspiration. I moved to Unilever, and it coincided, I would say, pretty much pitch perfect with the newly appointed chairman, who was Niall Fitzgerald, and a fellow Irishman, really nice guy, actually, very nice guy. And what struck me about Niall is, at that time, I think Unilever were described as obese. They really were, 1,600 product lines, massive portfolio of products that, were hundreds of years, well, certainly at least 100 years in existence. And Niall's ambition then was to severely chop that, and he did.
I'm right in thinking that's where you first came across the topic of agility in a corporate sense. Yeah,
absolutely. The adaptability and agility, because as a big part of the emphasis on my role was around our ability to respond to changing customer demand. Now, at that point, recognizing I had no necessarily formal training in systems thinking, I think what I was seeing was this in practice, and particularly our ability in practical terms to respond to a changing demand by one of the major supermarket stores in the UK, Sainsbury's, Tesco, and so forth. So one of our key performance metrics, which was our ability to respond to a almost instantaneous a transformation in our production system, so that we could deliver a different product, different style, and so on, different cost pricing, and so on and so forth. So in practical terms, that was something that I saw very, very early on. And one of my key performance metrics was in our ability to respond in the time that was given. Now, the bigger picture, I think, is important here, because what I found with Unilever, and particularly Niall Fitzgerald, was his preparedness to take risk, and to take risk and to learn from that, and clearly to learn from the consequences of failure. And he described it in terms of risk and failure, and I vividly remember him talking about this. And I found it particularly liberating that that's what I was hearing, was the preparedness to observe and to form theories on that observation in terms of what was necessary in order to enhance customer experience. Now, remember, again, I'll just repeat, at this point, I had no concept of the principle of systems thinking, the evolutionary theories, and so on and so forth. But nonetheless, I was hearing this in a very practical environment. What I also liked about the guy was he wasn't shy from saying we got it wrong. I think I mentioned this morning, one of the particular products we had, a scrubber agent was added, and essentially it shredded the clothes, which was a national scandal. But he took that on board as learning, and as a consequence of that, I think we clearly had to make some significant changes. So what was dominant about that was a consistent and persistent insights into customer experience. And within that frame, Rich, in and around our operation environment, we had access to around 2,500 house people, so people who used our products. And as a consequence of that, we could relate to them in terms of the ultimate consumer of the product. Now, whilst that may not have necessarily made a significant difference to how we did our everyday job, it was always uppermost in our mind. And I remember, one of the requirements of many of our employees, requirement was, should they see our product in their local supermarket, is they would prepare it, is it in its most presentational, in its best form, or if they notice a defect, actually they bought the product and we would refund the product. So that was very much in a practical sense. And what I needed, of course, to do was to consider, how does this look like in the bigger concepts of systems? So I thoroughly enjoyed my time at Unilever, and as a consequence of acquiring a new vocabulary, because people talk about the vocabulary you guys have, I think a new approach, and clearly I had been coached by Japanese senseis over a 3-year period, so I definitely had an approach and methodology. And I suppose my mental juices were starting to flow in terms of, what are the factors that we need to enable in order to not just deliver change, because change is an external event, but to deliver transformation.
So that's when you shifted over to Airbus then, yeah?
Yeah, so I went to Airbus, and I have to say that Airbus, that when I joined, I have to say it was a very tricky few months, and I would probably extend that longer. And it took a bit of soul searching to appreciate that perhaps it was worth sticking this out. So fight or flight, probably, I think, is probably an appropriate expression. And when I look at that, Rich, I suppose it's part of the challenge that perhaps our clients have too, is I was recruited in order to deploy a change program, but I didn't have any influence in terms of the diagnosis and the data that underpinned that deployment. So I didn't feel ownership. In fact, I actually felt helpless deploying a program for which I didn't necessarily have that commitment to make it happen. And that's a natural human response. And yeah, it was a struggle. It was absolutely a struggle. It was very lean focused. And I suppose herein lies the challenge, that when you're climbing up the scale of improvement as a fledgling organization who wants to embark on this stuff, is very different than Toyota, who've been doing it for 60 years. So the natural requirement has to be to understand the problem we're facing today in order to identify the methodology, not identify the methodology and try to influence that. So I suppose, it probably waxed and waned over a 18 months, 2 year period, but that's set against the backdrop, Rich, of a business area that frankly wasn't delivering. It was chaotic. It was chaotic. Very disjointed, very silo based, not a shared aim. And, we were struggling to respond to what were quite aggressive customer demands. And of course, they were getting more emphatic as time went on. So something had to give, and I suppose it's at that particular point in time, coincidentally with that to some degree, I met Jane Seddon, and Jane is the chairman of PMI, and I met Jane one morning, and I suppose what I saw in action was the system talking to itself. Jane had a very, very good way of getting me to describe my current situation, describe what I was experiencing and seeing, without it feeling like that I was going through this as an exercise. And I suppose as a consequence of that, what reassured me was that I wasn't completely insane. that the sort of characteristics and the hallmarks of improvement and those factors that were required were actually out there, and we needed to make a connection with that. But what we also needed was someone to take the risk. We needed someone to engage in that in order then to take this forward and to identify what our new aim is. And I clearly have the utmost regard for Norman Hardy, who was vice president of the business area that I was working in at that time. And this then comes down to this person who's going to take that risk. He's going to step across the line, who's going to be different, because that's what we need. Continuing to do what we always did clearly wasn't going to give you the result. And I think I know that to be true. I know it to be right. And what we had then was a galvanizing aim. So probably for the first time we had a compass bearing that as a senior leadership team, we identified ourselves rather than being identified for someone else. We also had the capability to go on that journey. But what we also had to be prepared for was the potential that what we were doing, because it was very focused on the combination of variation and variability reduction, but also lean and velocity and all of this sort of good stuff. So it was a good amalgam of a program, but it did have quite a significant Six Sigma element to that. And as a consequence, Rich, I suppose we therefore had to face into the challenge of that being seen to be counter. So this would be counter to the strategy of lean deployment. And I would suggest that perhaps was more a case of being different rather than being counter. And the thread that tends to run through for me is how prepared we are to respect diversity, difference. But what we see, the response to it is perhaps not what is actually underpinning them.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm going to come to that later on, but cutting to the chase, my friend, is probably fair to say that the foundations for what was an extremely successful program of improvement, significant strategic enhancements, capital expenditure, new product introduction, I would absolutely go back to those foundations as being established in and around that time. And of course, what also happened is the team turned over. It rolled over to new teams. So in other words, it wasn't someone shouting and sending bigger emails. It wasn't this character who was continuing to push. Actually, the processes and systems we had in place were self-perpetuating. They were able to continue without having necessarily this character in place.
So sorry, Baz. So having joined Airbus in 2001, then. So you came across PMI as a client in 2003.
Yes.
And then 2009, you joined the dark side under slightly strange circumstances, because it was actually coincided with the management buyout of PMI by myself at the time.
That's right.
In fact, I think you were first in under that arrangement. Joining the other side, obviously it was the of the coin, having worked as a consulting client and then moving into the consulting sector. Clearly you were building on a lot of that experience you'd had. And we've both looked back at the range of sectors that you've worked in during your time with PMI. I mean, it's everything from automotive, retail, maritime logistics, telecoms, power generation, power distribution. There's an awful lot in there. So you summed this up as national and international, many non-sector specific. So from all of that, then you're in one of these unique positions of applying this improvement stuff in so many sectors. So just chat us through that briefly, if you would, before we move into your thoughts that you want to share.
So great. And you asked me this question previously, and I've reflected on that, and I think it serves us well, and it serves an improvement professional well. Yes, absolutely, non-sector specific. And there may be some sectors that are not my cup of tea. And let's leave IT to one side. Let's
say, what are you about to say, Barry?
So I wouldn't go seeking them, because they don't necessarily float my boat, as we say. They don't necessarily excite me. But I think what is important, and I think this is an element. This is clearly respecting what I find. Well, I hope it's seen as being respecting what I find. Is there are sectors where there are elements of it's perceived to be a creative environment, and consequently that this sense of this perception that selling is a creative process, marketing is a creative process, and there's absolutely no question that there are elements of creativity there. And I suppose I would challenge, if I'm head of engineering, I might also want to step in and say, well, why is mine not creative? Okay, and I would want to listen to that too. But I think what has helped me, and I think I would encourage others, is everything we do is a process, Rich. Everything without exception. And no matter where we want to drift off left and right, that this doesn't apply to us, fundamentally, we do things. Yeah, we do things. And we do things in lots of different ways. So the concept of process management and process thinking are universal.
Well, this goes back to your comment earlier on about force of personality, doesn't it? This can't happen because XYZ is on holiday. No. Neglecting to identify that all work is a process. So how is it defined? How can it be? Is it necessary? Can it be sustained?
Yeah. And I appreciate that organizations are set up organogrammically, if that's an English word, and I'm Irish, so I'm allowed to get away with that one. But they're designed, they're set up by organogram, and aligned with that is a social organization, Rich. And the social organization, of course, it may perpetuate this. We're unique. We have this specialism. But unfortunately, I think we're pulling the wool over our eyes here, and and therefore there is a risk that if there's not a preparedness to open up to the wider possibilities, it then leaves us with silos.
Yeah.
So
not wanting to divert you, because I can sense where you're going. I think this sounds like a good time for you to jump into your slides, actually, Baz, because particularly on that subject of silos.
Yeah, right. So what I want to do, I don't know about you, Rich, but for all of the slides that we have in our slide packs, there is this one. I think there's a second one, but this one particularly, I think, resonate with a lot of people I've met. Where those who've worked with me in the past probably know I use lots of pens and paper, and I like to do lots of drawings. And I think this drawing, there is a historical context to it. But, it's not rational, is it? What is it like around here? So if I ask that question, and of course, having worked with Jane extensively over my time with PMI, I've been very fortunate. These are the sort of things that we're seeking to understand. Is let's cut to the chase here. What is it like? And I find this slide particularly revealing because it tends to resonate with many, many people. And if for this to be true, there's no rationale, there's no logical reason why we should recognize this to be the case, but we leave it as it is. And in the world that we're working in today, and it has changed over the 48 odd years, we're surprised. The new norm is today's new norm, because tomorrow we may have another. We've had COVID, and I don't need to go any further in terms of over my career. 9/11 had a significant impact on Airbus and so on. So there is always the potential for black swan. There's always potential to be surprised. So it's not rational, logical for us to recognize this scenario in a world of change and uncertainty and ambiguity. So if we know it exists, I think some of the theories that you might propose is that we're frozen. We're frozen in this silo, disjointed, fractured state, but actually it's okay because we're discomforted with it. We're comfortable with this level of discomfort, if that's a oxymoron or whatever. We're comfortable with that level of discomfort. But the only time that then really this comes to light and becomes a problem is when businesses are looking to transform. And I don't mean change in that, I mean transform. So before we talk about transformation, my question will always be in an organization, and I've been asked this question, so what's my job? Well, someone needs to care for the interdependencies here, because that is what this is missing. I don't see that guardianship, that governance, that nurturing of the relationships within an organization. And it starts from the top, Rich.
Well, it absolutely does, and and it's still, I've been in the improvement industry for 20 years this December, and it still surprises me. The corporate cultures have changed so much, and the sophistication of our organizations have changed so much, and yet still we see this siloed thinking of which is compounded by things like remuneration strategies or KPI diffusion.
Yes.
The lack of it's that sentiment that you just said there. Taking care of the interdependencies.
Yes.
And that's whose job is that? Because I've never seen it on an organogram or in a role description for that matter.
It isn't described. And of course this can be one of these almost like a smack in the face, and that's absolutely what's not intended. But I think there is probably a simple answer to the question. Who's telling us which direction we're going in, and recognizing it's got a maritime flavor here, so I make no excuses for that. So maybe my seafaring experience is relevant. Who knows? So who's telling us which direction we're going in? Who's ensuring that we have the capability to be able to deal with this? And who's ensuring that we play well together? So I typically let this slide seep into the conversation in order to hear people's reflections and what does that mean for them, and what's it like around here. So when I was looking at all of these, I wanted to think about something about the need, and we talked about agility and adaptability before, my experience in Unilever, but I didn't get to this level of sophistication. And frankly, it isn't sophisticated. If you want to survive, any species that wants to survive needs to think about what is the environment, how is this environment today? And without getting too deep into this, let's consider global warming. There is a crisis, and consequently, we need to sense what that crisis is. What data do we have on it? Any business today that is facing exponential change, growth, data needs and changing market customer demand, they need to be sensitive to, and this sensitivity, they need to be sensitive to that market, in both internal and external. Regulators, governments, trade unions, statutory bodies, as much as their employees, and obviously the customer. So
and I think I'd add to that, just to reinforce your point. Be conscious that the status quo is fleeting by its very nature.
Yes, it is. It is. So as senior leaders and improvement professionals, I think it's important that we consider then, if our culture is reactive, it's quite likely that we would be done to. And I think it's always been important for us to put our clients out there first. Our coaching would always be around not just being 1% better than your competitor, but actually being the best. So you don't have to worry about the customer or their competitor. Yeah. So a transformation is that ability to sense the changing climate, the environment. It's our ability, so generating data. It's being able to interpret that data and then being able to respond to. So fundamentally, on this page, I think is the role of a senior executive in the business. Mm-hmm. Consequently, it can tell us, we can be told where we're going. We understand the capability to be able to go on this journey, and we play well together.
Yeah, absolutely.
The other part I thought it would be useful to consider is this topic of liberating discipline, and I've put this in inverted commas because I can see this in a number of different ways. But I think it also goes to what our modus operandi really should be, and I'm putting this in the widest context. And I've already touched on creativity, and I think creativity is something that empowers the people that are working for us. And I know that sounds very cliche, but it happens to be true. The world of work is ever changing as well. And, as a consequence of that, it's the joys of work. And sometimes I say these words and I think, am I right? Is the joy going out of work? Is that expediency, the pressure, get it done? Is that now inhibiting creativity? So I suppose I look back over my career and this liberating discipline topic arose in the mid-90s. And as soon as you see the word discipline, Rich, I don't know about you, but it certainly strikes me, it's about bringing something, it's sort of undoing something that you're not happy with. Children, errant children. There's something about getting that rigor and discipline. But actually, this liberating of discipline was something that struck me in the mid-90s as being very useful to consider in future. And of course, the points that I'm about to make here, I hope underpin that. Now, those who have worked with me, they'll often hear me talk about my grandchildren, and my grandchildren are in that very curious, natural curiosity stage, inquisitive. And the quality and the power and the focus of the questions they ask are just super.
Most of the time.
Well, most of the time, yeah, most of the time. But certainly, I think we could probably do with going back to that sort of that innocence that enables us to be able to answer those questions.
Uh-huh.
And I don't want to explore that much further, but I think, do we have time to nurture this curiosity, this inquisitive that's in us all? But the question is when is it suppressed?
Well, linked to that, Buzz, is that point we chatted through earlier about it's your third point on this slide, is the authenticity, and you link that to, well, you posed a question I think earlier on about whether that was a matter of maturity and or culture. It's possibly both, of course. To be able to say, I just don't know what the answer is.
Absolutely.
And how acceptable is that in different work cultures and different organizations? I don't know what your reflection is on the time during your career, how that has changed.
Oh, I think that can be seen as a sign of weakness still, Rich. And I think getting alongside someone in order to create an environment where they feel safe to actually express that view. But if I'm honest, I don't wish to sound anything bigger than I might be. I would consider how I would feel in that position, and I would probably be reluctant to express to someone, actually, I see the compelling need to make change, but I'm frightened because I don't know how to do it.
So much of that comes back to the leadership behaviors and response and the perceived response, isn't it?
Yes.
Because we've got a client that we're currently working for that had a very big issue that someone had responded directly to this point, and it has done them nothing but good in terms of holding their hands up and admitting that they're out of their depth. It was respected by the leadership team, but I observed that at the time, and I said to the leader in question that no, that's not a typical response, disappointingly.
No. And the essence of PDSA for us isn't around observation and identification of the theories. And I go back to vocabulary, Rich. Even the vocabulary is often seen to be not one where some may wish to go. It sort of seems nebulous when actually it's liberating. It comes back to this liberating of discipline. Because what we're doing is we're actually looking for the widest possible opportunity rather than prevarication. Prevarication is something very different. Well, there are a couple of other things here, and I'll just expose the slide in its entirety.
So I better warn you, Baz, that we've got quite a few questions coming in. Just to let you know, when you're in your keeping one eye on the clock, which we'd like to get to.
Yes.
Well, you may not want to, but I do. So
you're the conductor of the orchestra. Okay, I think the slide then speaks for itself. I think I'm probably getting the drift that you want me to move on a little bit, which I'm perfectly I think you know me well enough to tell me. So these are some things that I offer, and I really want to get to hear some questions here. So I'm going to be quite brief with this. I've already described this tolerance and diversity and our reluctance to deal with difference. And if it's different, it's not us. Therefore, we're nervous, we're suspicious. And I, working with the global client, with the talent team, I actually learned a great deal from that. And in my old age, I can still do it. And I thought struck me as really important. The question or response you don't like, or you don't want to hear, maybe the very one you need. Now, I know what it's like when I'm asked a question that's coming from a very different place than my head, and what it makes me feel like. I need to address, why does it make me feel like that, rather than rejecting it. That's one point. So the second one is, please ask yourself, am I up for this? The exertion of all that human exertion of you and others, and let alone the financial implications. So listen to the words you use and say genuinely, do I mean that? Do I mean that? And you and I paraphrased a couple of cases. I remember specifically the CEO saying, do not forget, my door is always open. And when he left, one of the delegates says, I don't even know where his door is, let alone go through it. Free yourself from the tyranny of being right first time. Now, I will be expressing this as I work or have worked with people. This and Jane, thank you. Jane will always tell me that it is that allowance to permission to be inelegant, I think, is so important, Rich. And as we see green belts, fledgling green belts and black belts and process managers come through, we should allow and we should create that environment that it's safe to be inelegant. And be comfortable with ambiguity. Change is ambiguous, and consequently, today's current norm may actually not be the one tomorrow. So if I was talking to a business leader, there's no question, be explicit, or as explicit as you can, about what you're trying to accomplish here. Because too often when I ask about ambition, I'm told what we are going to do. Tell us where we're going. How do we know it's going to be an improvement? And give us a sense of the journey. Now, again, I think I need to free senior leaders up from the tyranny of having to answer all of the questions. In other words, how do we do that? Yeah. So, the first two questions are important. What are we trying to accomplish? And how do we know what's it going to look like when we get there? And I think that visioning is really important. I think the third question, that's the creative bit. That's the exploration, the observation and the theorizing. Encourage people to ask questions about why we're doing this. Why are we doing this? So, an example, I suppose, I did reference this, and hopefully this is okay. If you are embarking on a course of capability building, I have been sent on a course to spend 2 weeks with Baz, and you do not know why you're there. Probably I would ask you the question about, did you ask the question about what are you doing?
And why not?
And why not? What got in the way of us asking that question? The building of capability to comfortably and safely go on that journey. And what is that about? Well, in a nutshell, it is not the compelling need that's the difficult bit. It's how do I unfreeze people from their current discomfort such that they feel safe and confident and comfortable that they will be taken on that journey. And I am looking at you. I am looking at the senior leader, and I am seeing that end goal, but I am actually thinking in my head, I don't have confidence. And consequently, systems stay frozen, fearful. And we're fearful in the discomfort. That discomfort is better than the unknown, the difference. And finally, make sure that we play well together.
And so often, Baz, isn't it, that this comfortable and capable and comfortable journey that you describe, so often the leaders aren't even aware that that's not the case. Never mind that it's part of their role.
Yes, and I appreciate that today. I would suggest that my experience 40 years ago was very, very different today. I really have to applaud senior leaders in businesses who have much more complex relationships, much more complex shareholding, stakeholders, investors, regulators, and the customer. And it's difficult. And I would hope that I could empathize sufficiently to respect that. But nonetheless, I think also there is something about being sensitive to, and it comes back to, if we recognize the boat scenario, the boat illustration, maybe that's something that we might need to think about. How sensitive are we to those disconnects and otherwise?
And Baz, just to give you a bit of context on your next point that you're about
please.
to make around the customer, we've had a question in here around, particularly thinking about the comment you made about Unilever earlier on, the visibility of the customer.
Yes.
What would be your best advice, Baz, on how to approach customers to have conversations about what they think of an organization, their service, and their product, and what's it like to work with them? Just give you a bit of context. If that's a question, I know you're about to make a point about who is the customer.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, so the point I'm going to make is, who is our customer? I think that in numerical terms, probably the vast number of people that I've encountered in my career with PMI, probably their customers would be internal, and frankly, I think pretty much the same comments would go. But there is a uniqueness, and the uniqueness is, and the challenge, Rich, which I always find curious, is when we have discussions around who is your customer. I'm sometimes I can be a bit discomforted that I'm not getting the sort of answer I might expect. The customer is the person who has a problem. They have a need. which they can't fulfill. Therefore, they go to you to fulfill it, the tin of beans. Investors, regulators, governments, pull them all, they'll still be the person who needs the tin of beans. So in internal terms, I think we often have line of sight to the internal, those who are next downstream. But this then comes to this interdependency and this disconnect and the potential fracturing. So that's a relationship issue, and that's an issue about, how do we serve each other? What are the operational parameters we need to fulfill in order to make this product work? Yeah. But do remember, of course, that throughout this, there's a customer order proceeding through this. And I think we forget that. We forget to see the customer order moving from left to right. Yeah. The customer order does not move top to bottom like an organogram. It moves left to right. So who is our customer? Putting short-term expediency ahead of long-term solutions to problems. And I think I'm playing back the dynamic that I often see today in businesses where it's busyness, it's busy, busy, busy. And when we look at that busyness and consider how much of that busyness is actually improvement, dial turning, or how much of it is just addressing today's heroics, yeah. And I think I sense that the challenges to make decisions and do something is getting greater and greater. And ironically, Deming said, don't just do something, stand there. Standing there might actually be a good thing. Stand there and observe. What theories do you have? Observation. Mm-hmm. I think the third one is there is an exponential growth of data. Unquestionably, we are drowning in data, and exponential by its very nature. The question is how do we distill what's useful and what's questionable? And how are we going to know? And we do have many, many sources that may or may not be useful in terms of our decision making. But I think I need to emphasize that point, that data is there in order to inform good decision making. I have a sense that data is around collecting the stuff and feeling comfortable that we've got it. Mm-hmm. But like my story about transformation before, there's a value stream with data. We need to know what to collect, how to collect it, how to visualize it, how to interpret it, and how to respond to it.
It's intriguingly connected to that point above, though, isn't it, Baz, this? Because actually the creation and generation of data is also increasing in speed, volume, and therefore putting pressure on short-term expedience as well.
Absolutely spot on. And actually these points are all interconnected. They're not random musings of a mad Irishman. I think the final one probably, and it may be driven, Rich, by my IT, my reluctance to engage, and they could keep me awake at night. But I'm intrigued about where AI is taking us, and as I say in this bullet point, I think it's self-explanatory. That potentially, and I don't know yet because I haven't studied enough, and I'm not sure whether the critical masses have. My caution is around the potential of delegating a response we need to take, and it could be short-term expedient or long-term, and it's delegated to another source for which we have no idea the attitudes and the assumptions and their truth and their theories. So I'm sort of raising that as a caution flag, and I think for me, where I would to continue in business probably would be something that would discomfort me, and I would need to be reassured about that. I would be sensitive to how is this now playing out, and how do we continue to maintain control. It may be something or nothing. At this point, I just see that as a challenge for businesses, which I certainly didn't have when I started there 48 years ago.
Well, pro to the end there, Baz, because on the 27th of October, we have a PMI Live that is dedicated to that very subject.
Okay,
this genuinely wasn't a plant, folks, by the way. This that's just coincidence. It's
excellent.
On our radar, clearly. So our colleague Anthony Richardson is delivering a PMI Live called Drive Your Continuous Improvement with AI, which specifically looks at some of the myths, the challenges, and responses, and how the improvement professional can respond to AI and capture its benefits.
Excellent. So there it is. Go there. Brilliant.
So, Bazza, got some questions for you, if I may.
Okay.
So you've touched on quite a few of these already, and
Okay.
several of the questions have been answered inadvertently as you've gone through your material. Good news.
Sure.
So specifically thinking about this one, what would be your top advice to someone who's working in an environment where there's a fear of change? Where do you start?
Okay. I think, and let's be honest. I think most of our engagements have been in clients where there has been a problem, has been a challenge. So this is probably quite normal. And the majority of cases, I think, would fall into that. For me, and my own personal experience in industry, I typically like to get alongside and seek to understand. Now, there may well come in two forms. There may well be getting alongside and seeking to understand actually is letting the person themselves talk to themselves. You and I often reference this, and that's another skill I think that Jane enabled me, is enabling the person to be able to talk about their current situation. I think that's hugely important. And I think the other thing that struck me as well was, in my own experience, was this reluctance to deal with resistors. And I know the question isn't asking specifically about resistors, but I think I found and tested actually perceived resistors can be hugely data rich.
Yeah.
Okay. So I'm putting an hour's answer into that little time frame, but I think it's understanding what is actually going on for that individual. And it behoves us to take time to do that.
Well, the same applies to organizations, doesn't it? It's that in individual and the organization within it. It's precisely what we work on to try and understand that.
Yes. And that's
Fantastic.
probably the most emotionally challenging in the job of being an improvement professional.
Oh, without a doubt. So we have been overwhelmed with notes to you, Barry, personally. So I'm going to consolidate some of those up. And I also want to just take the opportunity to embarrass you while I'm at it. So if I was to do a word cloud on this lot, probably the biggest word in the middle would be inspirational and thank you. So people coming in who've been with comments about your appreciation for the difference you've made to their projects, to their organizations, to their programs. I'm going to compile all those up rather than try and read them out today, as much as I would like to keep embarrassing you, and I would enjoy myself doing that. So Baz, bearing in mind the time, I've got just a few words I'd like to say. So on behalf and kind of summarizing all of that stuff up, thank you to you, Baz. On behalf of the thousands of people whose work lives, I think it's safe to say, are ever better because of the work that you've done. Thank you. All of the messages that have come in during this session and during the last few weeks from PMI customers around the world are testament to the high regard in which you're held. And I know everyone says nice things about people when they retire and they wish them well, but this is genuine. This is from the horse's mouth. People have taken the time to do this. So the high regard in which you're held and the warmth and good humor with which you've worked, I know you are, but you should be very proud of what you've achieved in your career, and frankly, the difference you've made in transforming people's organizations. And I can see the comments lighting up here with responses. So Baz, thanks so very much. We really are going to miss you, as are our customers, evidently by the response that we've been having. Now we've got a big send off in a few weeks' time, so I'm not going to repeat my speech that I'm doing then. But just to wrap up the session finally, if I may. So we are back. Have you got my screen? You've got my screen, yes?
Perfect.
Yes, great. So we're back in September. And you've got with a fresh new look, the beady eyes of amongst you may have noticed. We'll be launching the season 4 of PMI Live in September the 29th. And we've got some great new topics for you. Leading for Success, kicking off on the 29th of September, where we'll be asking, do you have a leadership problem? We'll be borrowing heavily on some of the comments that Baz has made today. You'll be pleased to hear. That's going to be a live panel discussion with myself and several of my colleagues. The whole schedule is available to book now on the link you see on the screen, pmi.co.uk/webinars. or just scan the QR code that's on the screen. So Baz, thank you very much again. Thank you everyone for joining us this afternoon. It's been great to have you with us. Cheers all. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Rich, and thanks everyone. I really appreciate it.